Now, slots are an important feature, and as you can tell by now, also a quite powerful feature, and you can do a lot of things with them in Vue, as you can tell. Now, there's one last thing about slots which I also want to mention here. It's definitely advanced, but it is worth knowing about it. For that, I'm going to create a new component, CourseGoals.Vue, and I'm going to add a template here. And in that template, I want to output a list. And for the moment, I'll not care too much about the styling and so on. I just want to focus on this slots feature, which I want to show to you. So I have an unordered list, and I have a script here defining my config object for this component. And in there, let's say we have some data. And we have some goals in here, which of course could be dynamic, but for the moment, I'll just define them like this. Simple strings like finish the course and learn Vue. So definitely nothing too fancy here. Now, of course, we can render list items here with v-for by looping through our goals as you learned it. We can also add that key and set that to our goal, for example, so to that string, assuming that every string is unique in this array. And then, of course, we can output our goal here. And now we could go to app.vue, for example, there import this newly created component. So import course goals from /components course goals.vue, and thereafter register it as a local component so that we can then use it in the template here. So let's do that. And I will simply add it here, course goals, like this. So now I added my component here, and hence we see the goals here. And as I mentioned, the styling is off, but that's not the focus here. Now, what does this have to do with slots? Sometimes, if you're building a component which you might want to share with other people, with other colleagues, or which gets used in different ways in a bigger project, you want to make certain aspects of that component customizable. For example, here, we could have this component which has the course goal data, which maybe also has more logic related to that, and which then takes care about rendering those course goals to the screen. But there's one thing which you might want to make customizable, and that is the content of every list item. With that, I mean if you just have the text in the list item, if you maybe have a h2 tag in there, maybe multiple elements. So maybe you want to make that customizable so that this course goals component could be used in different parts of the app, but the content of the list item could be different every time it is getting used. Now for that, we could of course think about using a slot here, right? We could enter a slot here. And if we have a slot here, the content, the HTML markup, which is passed to a list item, can be defined from inside the place where course goals gets used. And that sounds exactly like what I'm trying to do here. So in AppView, where I'm using course goal, I could now pass in my content for course goals. And I could say that I want to have my goal text inside of a h2 tag here. But that's now where the problems start. Yes, I can pass in my markup, but I have a big problem. I don't have access to the individual goal for which this list item is getting rendered. This goal variable is only available here inside of course goals. But the markup, which should be output in here, is getting passed in from app.vue here. And here I don't have access to this goals or goal variables, which I'm using in course goals. And for this specific scenario, where you want to build something like that, Vue has another feature. It has scoped slots. Now, what are scoped slots about? The concept of scoped slots is about letting you pass data from inside the component where you define the slot to the component where you pass the markup for the slot. And you do that by going to the component where you have the data and where you define the slot. And then on the slot, you can add a prop. For example, goal. This name is up to you. And you can also bind it with vbind or with the shorthand to a dynamic value, in my case here to goal. And to avoid naming confusion here, I'll name this item, though you could absolutely also use goal. That would be okay, but to make it clearer, I'll name my prop item here and pass this goal, which is created for every iteration, to item. Now these names are up to you, but whatever you set as props on slot, so on this slot element, will now be accessible in the place where you pass data for that slot. In this case here in app.view, where I'm passing this markup for my slot. And here we can now get access to that data by adding a template around our slot markup, so around the markup which we want to pass into that slot. And on that template we use vslot, or the shorthand, for the default slot in this case. But the same concept would apply to named slots, of course. And now here we can define any name of our choice, like slot props. But this name is also up to you. This simply is the name of a variable which you can define, which Vue will give you. And this variable, the value you get for this variable, so the value you get for slot props in this case, will always be an object where all the props you define here on slot are merged in. So if you had another prop here with some data, that would also be part of slot props of this object, accessible under the another prop key. And I'll actually leave that here for demo purposes. Here it's not bound, it's just set to a string. So now here we got this slot props thing. And what can we do with it? Well, you can now use that inside of this template. For example, here to interpolate between the h2 tags and now access slot props dot item. Dot item because I added an item prop here on my slot. If you chose a different name here instead of item, it's a different name here as well. And below that, I'll also add a paragraph where I output slot props. And now here using this square bracket notation so that I can access a property with a dash inside of it and then referring to another prop which I defined here. Important, here Vue will not convert this automatically to a camel case notation. So if you have another prop with a dash here in course goals, you need to access it with exactly the same name here in the place where you define the markup. And that's why I need that square bracket notation here, because with the dot notation, this would be invalid JavaScript code. With the square bracket notation, this works. So now with that, if we save that, we see our output here, including the dots from the another prop, which I defined for demo purposes. And this hopefully makes it clear how scoped slots work. It's definitely a niche and advanced feature. You will not need it all the time, but there are specific scenarios where it is impossible to build what you want to build if this feature wouldn't exist. And that's of course why I'm covering it here as well. But be aware that it's definitely a niche feature. Now there's one simplification which we can make here, by the way. If you're only targeting one slot, only the default slot here, you can remove that template here. And let me first of all cut this. Remove this unnecessary template wrapper and instead add this hash default slot props thing directly on your component tag. This is only allowed if the markup between your opening and closing tags here should entirely go into just one slot, into the default slot here. Then you can use this simplified code here. As you can see, it works. And then this is the shortest way of writing this in the end. And that's now really it for slots and also for scoped slots. I know it's a lot. We'll see it in action throughout this course in various projects. And the scoped slots feature, as mentioned, is also a very advanced and niche feature.